Video demonstrates the use of the orthodromic snare technique in a step-by-step process. Okay, we start off with difficult anatomy, and we recognize that there's a tortuous vein, and these are the tools that we're going to need, and it's important to have each of these available, and I will emphasize the importance of the polymer tip wires, the Choice PT floppy straight tip. So we start off by engaging the os of the vein with a tip of the appropriate shape vein selector. In this case, we started off with the standard shape. Once the vein is engaged, we're going to advance a light support polymer tip wire into the vein, and once the wire is in the vein, we'll slide the vein selector up over the wire. Now you'll notice that there's a curl in the tip of the wire. It's important not to remove the wire if it becomes bent like this, because the bent wire is going to be used to stabilize the vein selector and orient the tip of the vein selector so that when the second wire is advanced, the tip doesn't bend and it can be advanced through the collaterals, as illustrated here. So we have the wire through the collaterals and then back into the coronary sinus. So at this point, we're going to prepare our 4 French 10mm snare and advance it into the sheath besides the 5 French vein selector. With this approach, we're using a single catheter, 9 French in diameter, so there's enough room for both the 4 French snare and the 5 French vein selector. How we snare the wire once it reaches the CS depends on whether the wire turns back into the CS towards the great cardiac vein, or if the wire heads out of the CS into the right atrium. When the wire comes out of the middle cardiac vein and turns back up into the coronary sinus, it's relatively easy to snare because it's in a contained space. So what we do here is we position the snare in the coronary sinus and then withdraw the wire and then advance the snare or the wire into the open snare. And it's important to get 15 centimeters of wire through the loop in the snare before you close the snare on the wire. Once the snare is closed, we want to position the tip of the closed snare right at the os of the vein, and it's important not to pull the snared wire back into the sheath, so you want to get the sheath back out into the right atrium. On the other hand, when the wire exits the middle cardiac vein directly into the right atrium, we take a different approach to snaring the wire. With this, we start by, again, putting the snare in the body of the CS, and then once it's in position, we'll hold the snare and the vein selector together and then withdraw the sheath until it's out in the right atrium, and it's important to get it out into the right atrium. With the sheath in the right atrium, the vein selector is held in place and their snare is positioned over the os of the exit vein. In this case, it's the middle cardiac vein. So we're holding the vein selector and withdrawing the snare and positioning it right over what we think is the os of the middle cardiac vein. So once we have it in position, we'll withdraw the wire and then re-advance it into the open snare. We think that the wire has been snared, but when we close the snare, we can see that here's the tip of the snare and the wire is not within the tip of the snare catheter, and we can see that the wire has not been engaged by the snare. So if we look in the RAO projection, we can see that the loop is not positioned properly, and we could withdraw and advance the wire many times and never get the wire to go into the snare. So we have to reposition the snare in the RAO projection, and when we do that, then we're able to advance the wire into the open snare. And this time when we close the snare, we're able to capture the wire. In some cases, even with the RAO position, it can be difficult to snare the wire as it exits the MCV or another exit vein into the right atrium. So one option is to position the snare inside the middle cardiac vein or whatever vein the wire is coming out of. So to do that, we want to get the snare into the middle cardiac vein. To do this, we start by loading a wire into the snare catheter. And then once we have the wire in the snare catheter, we're going to advance the glide wire into the middle cardiac vein, and then slide, as you can see here, we're sliding the snare catheter into the middle cardiac vein. Once the snare catheter is in the middle cardiac vein, we remove the glide wire and load the loop of the snare into the snare catheter, as illustrated here. So now we have our loop in the middle cardiac vein. We withdraw the wire and advance the wire into the snare, close it, and now we have the wire securely fastened. Another option, if you're having difficulty snaring, is to use the KA2 as the snare catheter. That is, the snare catheter can be replaced with a 4 French angled catheter to aim the loop of the snare in the desired direction. And that looks like this. Here we have the KA2 catheter, and we've inserted the 10 millimeter snare, and now this gives us direction so that when the wire can be the snare is closed on the wire. Now, it's important that you advance 15 centimeters through the snare before closing the snare. If you only advance 5 centimeters or so, you can pull the tip of the wire off and have embolization issues. If the wire is snared 6 to 10 centimeters from the tip, you can bend the wire to the point that you won't be able to get the wire to go back through the pacing lead. You can put all the tension you want on the wire if you've snared it at 15 centimeters using a 4 French snare. On the other hand, if you're using a 2 catheter technique, 2 catheters, one for the snare and one for the vein selector, there's a tendency to use larger snares. Larger snares are more likely to bend wires, and it's also larger snares are more likely to have the wire slip through. The other way that a wire can be bent inadvertently is to actually pull the vein selector, pull the snared wire back into the sheath. If you pull the snared wire back into the sheath, you can see, as illustrated here, you'll bend the wire, and when you bend the wire, it can make it difficult to pull the tip through the pacing lead. So if you do bend the wire, don't release the snare and try to pull the bent tip through the pacing lead. If you do, the wire can fracture at the bend and then that tip embolize, or the bend can stick at the tip of the lead and you'll need to remove the lead and start all over again, and you may not get back through the collaterals. So my recommendation for the situation where you bend the wire is don't release the snare, remove the pacing lead, advance the SureCross microcatheter in place of the lead all the way through the collaterals up to the snare. Flush the microcatheter, and then remove the wire by simultaneously advancing the wire into the microcatheter and pulling the snare into the sheath. Once you get the wire, all the wire out by pulling it out the sheath, then you can put the snare back into the CS and insert a new wire through the microcatheter. To secure the wire, once it's been snared, the right hand presses the open hemostat against the hub of the snare catheter, and while you're doing this, the left hand pulls the snare loop tight against the wire, and then at that point the hemostat is closed at the hub of the snare catheter, keeping everything tight like this. And you want to see this crinkle up a little bit here, indicating that you have plenty of tension. Once you have it snared, you can put tension on the wire, which then pulls against the snare, and you can use that tension to advance pacing leads through difficult anatomy. Now you can see here we were able to successfully advance the wire through that area of stenosis that we had previously, as well as the tortuosity. To do that, we actually put enough tension on the wire that you can see that I've pulled the snare down into the middle cardiac vein, which doesn't really hurt anything, but you don't get the tension necessarily that you need. So to avoid inadvertently pulling the snare down into the sheath, you can put a second hemostat right where the snare enters the hub of the sheath. Now, once you have the lead in place, the thresholds are tested with the wire in place and the lead snared. The thresholds will only change slightly once the snare is released and the wire is removed. So we test our thresholds and we're happy with it. We don't see any change in any phrenic pacing. So to prevent any chance of lead dislodgement, the sheath is removed with the wire still snared. Again, the thresholds may change only slightly once the snare is released and the wire is removed. So now we've removed the sheath, and we're going to add some extra slack to make sure the slack's in good position, and then open the snare and withdraw through the wire through the open snare until the tip of the wire is clear of the snare but still in the pacing lead, as illustrated here. You can see the wire is free of the snare, but it's still in the pacing lead. At this point, we close the snare and remove the snare, and then holding the lead in place, the snare is removed, and then after a final adjustment of the slack and the LAO projection, as illustrated here, the wire can be removed. So the last step is actually removing the wire. In some cases, even with a snare, you're going to need venoplasty, as illustrated in this case. So if the wire doesn't go, rather than pulling very hard, my recommendation is that you remove the lead and replace it with a balloon, and then do venoplasty, and then you'll be able to get your lead into place. I think it's important to review the potential for bending the wire once again. You want to snare the wire 15 centimeters from the tip, which is a lot further than you might guess looking at an x-ray. We talked about this previously. And if you're using a 4 French 10 millimeter snare, you can pull very hard and push and get really good tension and close the snare without worrying about bending the wire. The other way to bend the wire is to actually pull the snared wire back into the sheath. And you can do this if you don't get the sheath out of the coronary sinus once the wire is snared. And again, if you do bend the wire, don't release the snare and try to pull it out through the tip of the lead. The best thing to do, in my opinion, is to keep the snare closed, remove the pacing lead, advance the sure cross microcatheter through the collaterals, all the way through the collaterals until it's out into the right atrium, flush the microcatheter, and then completely remove the wire using the snare by advancing the wire into the microcatheter and withdrawing the wire using the snare back into the sheath. Once the wire is completely out of the body, you can put the snare back into the sheath, into the coronary sinus, and then insert a new wire into the microcatheter and re-snare it. I hope you find this useful. If you have any questions, please let me know at my email address, which is seth@mcworley.com. Thank you very much.